is Donald Trump pushing past the guardrails of nonpartisan rule of law, making good on the threats that he did publicly make throughout the year, some of which involve potentially unlawful, illegal conduct done within the halls of government. While Trump backed down on that big attorney general pick that was so controversial, Matt Gaetz, going into the holidays, he is now announcing that he plans to fire the FBI director, who was a holdover actually from his administration, fire the FBI director that's still serving as of tonight in the Biden administration, Chris Wray, part of a 10-year term, and take that key post and fill it with a right-wing established conspiracy theorist, Kash Patel, who has talked about basically defund the police on a federal level, taking apart the FBI as we know it. Closing the headquarters is one of the things he's claimed he would do if he got in this kind of job. Patel has worked as a prosecutor. He served in Trump's first administration. He is someone who says that he is loyal not necessarily to the country, the Constitution, certainly not to the current FBI, which he calls the deep state or worse, but is loyal to Donald Trump and whatever he says Trump's MAGA movement stands for. He has also taken positions in his adult public life that are certainly at odds with anything we've ever seen from any FBI director in either party's administrations. For example, selling things that would sound like a scam or a type of fraud, for example, anti-vaccine pills that would reverse the effects of the COVID vaccine. That's not a medical thing. It's more of a misleading sort of money-making scheme. And Patel is someone who has claimed that if he got this kind of power in the new Trump administration, that he would seek retribution. Now, as I've told you before, we follow these things carefully, and it is perfectly fine for a new administration to want to change policies at DOJ or FBI and to be critical of past, even alleged abuses of power. But what he has done is basically talk about the current nonpartisan career bureau people at the FBI and other parts of the government and said that they themselves are, and he says this without evidence, this is a kind of a pre-fact check of what you're about to see, he says they're traitors, that they are basically borderline treasonous, even though he's never had any evidence or names to back that up. So this is sort of MAGA, neo-McCarthyism now being teed up to run one of the most powerful positions in the government. Here's one thing that he said on that score.
What you have is a buildup of so many actions by the deep state that it becomes borderline treasonous.
Borderline treasonous. He's talking, of course, about the police. Remember, the Federal Bureau of Investigation are the federal arm of law enforcement, just as the state and city arm are police. The federal arms are the Bureau. So we call them federal agents, but he's just attacking police. And this is something we've seen before. There are many people around Trump, and sometimes Trump himself, who are against law enforcement. They're against police. They're against the blue, as it's sometimes called, whether the blue is reporting into the local city department, that's police department, or the blue is reporting in federally, which is FBI agents. And if that sounds a little off or different from the branding we've heard over the years, there are two reasons for that. One, decades back, the Republican Party was more of a, quote, law and order party, and it definitely generally sided with law enforcement. That's no longer true. And then second is the reason you probably already know, because Donald Trump and many of his aides have been caught in so many situations that have led to investigations, prosecutions, sometimes convictions. They have turned on the people doing that work. They have turned on the feds, the FBI. And so they have a very vested reason in trying to delegitimize anything that happens by the FBI because they've been on the other side of it. Then there are claims by Trump, which he ran on, and now Patel, which you're going to see because he's being tapped for this, among other reasons, that they would abuse federal powers and go after the various forces in American life that they see as somehow holding them accountable. That could be the peaceful political opposition, targeting Democrats in this case, or others who've been critical of Trump. They've talked about going after Liz Cheney. She's a lifelong Republican. And they've also talked about going after the journalists who report on them, the free press.
We will go out and find the conspirators, not just in government, but in the media. Yes, we're going to come after the people in the media who lied about American citizens. We're going to come after you. Whether it's criminally or civilly, we'll figure that out.
Now, there are a lot of people concerned about Patel who go well beyond, say, what you might call the 48% of the country that voted against Donald Trump, or his assorted critics and people who might be somehow politically opponents of Trump and MAGA. There are people saying that this is a QAnon conspiracist. Someone who served in Donald Trump's first term in national security has said quite clearly Patel is totally unqualified for the position, the dictionary definition of a sycophant, and that Trump's ultimate statement here, made with the Patel pick coming after Gaetz, is the second term will be driven by retribution. Wall Street Journal, which is the sister publication of Fox News, has noted Patel has a credential problem and has never worked as an FBI agent, which would certainly be unusual for rising to director. His supporters, I should note, say that he has some law enforcement background. Bush White House veteran David Frum, who is a Trump critic and who has been on this and other programs, writes in The Atlantic that this is actually worse than Watergate. It threatens to turn the FBI into an instrument of personal presidential power and thus payback. Now, Donald Trump has a cabinet full of nominees, and they are just nominees. They have to get through the Senate, but the slated cabinet plan are these nominees who clearly are being prized for something other than credentials. It's what in MAGA they call loyalty, what in traditional nonpartisan work they would call a potentially disqualifying partisanship. And the larger question here, after the big clash and loss for Donald Trump with Matt Gaetz, is what does it tell you that if he loses on one side of the retribution agenda, he quickly rushes to someone who is as controversial or worse on the same problems? Many people have pointed out that while in traditional presidencies, a cabinet loss, especially an early big one like AG, would lead the president, or in this case, president-elect, to take a step back, to compromise, to recalibrate. Well, this ain't no normal term we're heading into, and this ain't no normal president-elect, and he is not taking a step back whatsoever at the widespread rejection of his very partisan AG pick. The first one, Matt Gaetz. With Patel, he is doubling down. He is vowing to fire the current FBI director, whom he selected in the first term, which itself is unusual, and put in someone who's more than a loyalist, someone who has vowed in public to do things that could actually get you charged by the FBI and the DOJ in a normal situation, abusing power, abusing government resources, and going after free speech. We're joined by a former civil prosecutor in the Southern District, Maya Wiley, and civil rights expert. Maya, your thoughts on this pick, and starting with substance, regardless of all the noise out there, is this person at all qualified for this job?
Well, thank you, Ari. And let me just start with Kash Patel is not qualified for this job. And I want to make something very clear. It's not because Kash Patel was a public defense attorney at one time. You don't have to only be a prosecutor, I think, to head the FBI. But at the same time, he's never had a position of leadership in a significant office before that I can tell. I mean, and think about this. The FBI has 35,000 staff members. It is massive. It has billions of dollars in budget and covers a litany of serious crimes, including counterintelligence here in the United States, like when Russia comes to interfere in our elections. And I say that because we have heard so much from Donald Trump about who he doesn't consider qualified, no matter what a long list of experience they have on their resume. Christopher Wray, for example, who we appointed, had been in several offices across up and down the chain in the Department of Justice, tons of experience within the agency, including at very high levels of the agency. So clearly was ready to handle something the size of the FBI. That is very different in terms of Kash Patel's resume. But as you point out, Ari, it isn't just about the job experience on paper. It's about understanding what the job is. And the job of the Federal Bureau of Investigation is to investigate crimes, not to serve as someone that Kash Patel himself has referred to in a children's book as the king. That flies in the face of what we need the FBI to be, which is an independent investigator that takes seriously both the Constitution and the rule of law.